Welcome to From Leads to Leases, a CCR Growth podcast that helps senior living providers transform their complex challenges into opportunities. Listen in for stories from industry leaders, innovative strategies, and insights. And with our expertise, learn how to increase occupancy faster, guaranteed.
Welcome back to another episode of From Leads to Leases, the podcast where we dive deep into the senior living industry, offering insights, strategies, and stories from the experts at the forefront. I'm your host, Jerry Vinci, CEO of CCR Growth, here to guide you through the evolving landscape of connecting communities with the families and residents they serve. Today, we're honored to have Chris MacLellan with us, a respected LGBTQ caregiving advocate, speaker, and author of What's the Deal with Caregiving? Chris has dedicated his life to supporting LGBTQ seniors and their families as they navigate the complexities of caregiving. As the founder of the Whole Care Network, Chris offers a wealth of resources, education, and support for caregivers, and his journey has been highlighted in the Pulitzer Prize-nominated caregiving story In Sickness and in Health, A Couple's Final Journey, featured in the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. In this episode, we'll explore the unique needs of LGBTQ seniors, the importance of inclusive care in senior living, and the steps communities can take to create truly welcoming environments. Chris, welcome to the show. We're grateful for your time and eager to learn from your experiences.
Well, greetings, Jerry. It's great to be with you, and kind of a little nervous today because I'm on the other side of the podcasting today. But goodness, what great work you're doing, and happy to kind of dig into this very important conversation.
Me too, Chris. And for those of you who are listening and not watching, you can't see Chris's setup, but it's very clear to me that Chris is an avid podcaster like myself. He's got quite the setup. So I always like to start with background and kind of your personal journey, how you got started in this space, and your journey specifically as a caregiver is very powerful story. And it began with your partner, Richard's illness. So can you share how that experience shaped your work in caregiving advocacy, especially within the LGBTQ community?
Well, first of all, I always start out by giving credit to my four older sisters who really gave me the care gene as I grew up. I watched them, watch them raise all their kids. I have 25 nieces and nephews, 40 great nieces and nephews. Wow. They call me the FU. And what do you think?
Fun uncle.
The favorite uncle.
Uncle.
I always like to give credit to my sisters for giving me the care gene. And I pretty much my entire life I've been in social work, in and around some form of senior care, whether it's non-ordained ministry or working formally within social service settings. I've always gravitated to senior care. Then I found myself in a caregiving role going back to 2010 when my now deceased partner, Richard Schiffer, was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. In one sense, I was fortunate that being a social worker, I kind of knew the ropes of how systems work, but there's a big difference when it comes to being a client versus having to deal with an illness individually or with your spouse or partner. And through the experience, while I was able to tap into my personal experience as a social worker, dealing with the emotional issues of a diagnosis of your loved one was quite difficult for not only me but for Richard.
Sure.
But through the experience, we kind of found our voice. We started a blog called The Purple Jacket. The metaphor there is I'm wearing purple today on purpose, but the metaphor there was caregiving took its physical toll on me, where I probably gained 50 or 60 pounds in the midst of his caring for him, because one of the rules of thumbs that happens for caregivers is you lose the sense of taking care of yourself because you're so focused on somebody else. But I don't have any regrets. We We did the blog together. It was a part of our reaching out to a broader community where we had friends inquiring about us all over the world. And then it kind of morphed into podcasting and getting involved as an advocate. And along the way, during our experience, while I was working in social service, we came across, we were a reporter from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel who wanted to do a story on same-sex couples and caregiving. It was supposed to be just a pictorial story, but in the midst of them following us, a couple of things happened early on where we were discriminated against in care. And it was from there that they realized that the story was bigger than just a pictorial story. And they ended up, they ended up following us for a good 6-7 months and produced this marvelous story that
Beautiful
I'm
story.
so grateful to have as a remembrance of Richard. But it really tells the story of the similarities and the differences that LGBT caregivers face in the midst of care. And the reason our story was so successful, it's been read over 500,000 times, was that people could put themselves in our shoes. Because when it comes to care and caregiving, there's no strangers. Everybody has a story. Everybody understands the path. While the roads might be a little bit different, the journey's all the same. And that's one of the main reasons why 10 years past Richard's passing, I've stayed in this role as an advocate to help those who will be in a care role, whether it's informal or formal. And it's kind of been my life work, especially these last 10 years.
Yeah, it was a beautiful article, and just I have to commend you on all the work that you're doing. It's everything that I've read and watched of yours is so thoughtful in this space and really just aimed just to help educate people. And I think that's the greatest gift that you can give back from this experience. Not a lot of people do that when they're in a situation like this. They kind of like go inside themselves, and you did the opposite. You've put yourself out there in so many different ways. Yeah, I think it's huge. I'm in awe of everything that you've done in the midst of this. So can you tell us a bit about the experience of what it was like to go through that with the Sun Sentinel and how that experience has helped kind of raise awareness about the unique challenges LGBTQ seniors face now?
Right. The experience with the Sun Sentinel was even to this day. I often like to say the two reporters, the journalist and the photojournalist, while it wasn't discovered, you couldn't notice this in the story itself. We became friends because they could relate to they were in the midst of caregiving a little bit for themselves. So. Caregiving is everywhere. It's in every boardroom. It's in every neighborhood. It's there. And the experience in and of itself, people would ask me, so how could you have these folks follow you around and be there with you all the time? And they even, a couple of times they've spent the night at the house just to kind of, to observe what our experience was. But you really hardly even notice that they were there because you're so focused on care for the person that's entrusted in your care. We were just two people who loved and cared for each other in the midst of a very serious illness that could have been anybody. Our story, I think it's important for people to be able to share their story, whether it's formally like we did in a newspaper article or informally to a neighbor, because it's cathartic. And it's also informative because the best information and referral that I have found in my entire career as a social worker is usually from one caregiver to another, or from somebody that's been involved in a service to somebody who's looking for a service. And that's kind of been my life experience as a social worker. And it really is more prevalent with care and caregiving, because no caregiver is going to provide another caregiver bad referral. It's just not something that's going to happen. And that's another one of the reasons why I've stayed in this, is to allow people to not only to read our story, but to help them understand that in sharing their story, they find some relief and they find some resources, as do other people. And that's what's so critical, because in most cases, and I use this on my podcast, I've not met anybody that's had caregiving on their bucket list of things to do in life.
No.
It usually happens because it's an untimely diagnosis or an unfortunate accident, and you're thrust into this role, and most of the time you don't really know what the resources are. And it's similar to, while a lot of people try to plan ahead for senior living, oftentimes people find themselves in senior living because they're coming out of rehab, or there's been some extenuating circumstance that places them in the setting. And in a lot of cases, people are making decisions when they're in an emotional setting.
Yeah.
And we all know what happens when we make decisions that are based on emotions. They're usually regrettable.
I agree with that. I definitely see the similarity with senior living and caregiving in that sense. And a lot of my previous guests, we talk often about the fact that senior living and senior care and planning for it is one of the few things that people don't often think about ahead of time. And often it's almost it's an afterthought, right? They probably should have been thinking about it 6 months ago or a year ago, or maybe even further back than that, depending on where their loved one is at in their journey. My situation, I look at my parents, they're in their mid-70s, it's a conversation we haven't even had yet. And anytime I try to bring it up, my dad's like, oh, we'll tackle that when we come to it. That's a little alarming to me, because I know that all it takes is one bad fall or one serious, illness that comes out of nowhere, that everything changes overnight. And then we have to start having some serious conversations and making some quick decisions. And that's the scary part for me. But I think most people don't really get the time to plan for it. It's not like buying a car, where like you've done it 10 times before and you have time to do the research and get all these things figured out, and exactly what it's going to cost. And there's just so many unknowns when it comes to senior care. And I think that's the scary part for people.
Well, it is hard to have those conversations, but it's very necessary. Yeah. I think at least 60 to 65% of people in America don't have any advance directives in place. How do you have those conversations about care? I approach it a little bit differently. I often like to suggest that, well, if being the caregiver, if I know what your wishes are, what your desires are, then I can be a better advocate for you in any care type of situation, whether it's dealing with the legal system, the medical system, or the senior living system. If I know your wishes, then I can be the best advocate for you, because when it gets right down to care and caregiving and the caregiver, the main role of a caregiver is to be an advocate, to speak on behalf. But it's hard to speak on behalf if you don't have the information behind you in order to do that. And Richard and I were lucky in one sense that I knew exactly what he wanted.
Yeah.
Up until the time of his death, I knew. So I never had to second guess any decision I made, because we had the conversation. I knew exactly what he wanted. He got everything he wanted it leading up to his life transition. That doesn't mean systems that were already in place didn't try to interfere, because they did. But I was fortified knowing that, I'm going to get emotional, that I knew exactly what he wanted. And as difficult as that day was, it was a tad bit easier because I had the information from the source on how to follow through.
Reading the article, I recall it talked about the fact that you had that conversation with Richard pretty early on in your relationship. Was that mainly due to you knowing about his health prior to, or I know there was an age gap as well. What was
Right,
kind
there
of
was an age gap.
Yeah.
In our there was a 20-year age gap, and Richard had cared for his previous partner of 40 some odd years, who had died of Parkinson's. So we had an understanding of what the systems were all about, but we also, with my coming from a social service background, I mindful to your audience that our relationship was prior to marriage equality.
Sure.
I knew that it was going to be important for both of us to be able to have the legal documents in place so that we could be the advocate for each other, and that if we were to meet a professional, I would use that, I kind of use that word lightly, a professional in any setting that questioned who we were, that, I had the legal documents, and I carried those legal documents everywhere I went in my green folder. Marriage equality, majority of Americans support marriage equality. One of the areas that people don't recognize what's important about it is all the rights of marriage transfer right upon death. When you're up there at the altar, you're saying "to death do us part." I mean, you're not really thinking about that part of life.
Yeah.
You're thinking about the reception, you're thinking about your honeymoon, but you're not thinking about the longevity. But all the rights given upon marriage transfer up until death. And if you're an unmarried couple and you don't have all your legal documents in hand, you're not their next of kin. And that applies whether it's you're a heterosexual couple or a gay couple. The bonds of marriage have far-reaching implications to your legal rights, to your spouse or your partner. And they are, again, it's a part of that long-standing conversation that folks need to have about what are your wishes and how are they going to be executed.
Mm-hmm. Legally speaking, I mean, there's ways to protect yourselves even if you're not in a marriage, right?
Exactly.
Regardless, yeah. So I think you guys went about that the right way to at least give you the decision-making power in those situations, even if you got some pushback from some of the professionals, like you said, along the way.
Because I think the other thing that's important to mention here, Jerry, is that we're never going to eradicate bigotry.
Oh.
People ask me often throughout the midst of the story, and even now 10 years past, he said, well, what's different for an LGBT caregiver? And I would always say, well, there's really not too much different. We all want to be able to love and care for our spouse and our partner with as little drama as possible. But then I follow that up by saying, but I'm not naive. I understand that for LGBT caregivers, there are some differences, there are some nuances. And it usually comes from systems that are not in place to protect the dignity of all human beings. Because let's face it, again, people are going, in any profession, are going to have their own personal beliefs about same-sex couples. Organizations, whether it's doctors' offices, hospitals, senior living communities, there's a lot of ways that they can combat that, where their client, their patient can feel comfortable in being themselves, because aging happens to everybody. It's There's people age differently. We all come from different backgrounds and experiences, but we all want to age in as much peace and tranquility as we possibly can. And we want to be able to put ourselves in positions to where we know that we're safe. And that's kind of across the board for everybody. It doesn't really make any difference if you're gay or straight, but for today's gay seniors, and I think we have to be mindful about what they grew out of. Today's gay seniors, including myself, as I approach 68, but you think about what life was like for them in the 60s and 70s, leading up to, to Stonewall, the discrimination, the workplace discrimination, healthcare discrimination. They've government discrimination. I forget when, I think up until the mid to late 70s, don't quote me on that, gay people weren't allowed to work in the government. So when you think about that mindset of what today's LGBT seniors have grown out of, then you kind of can put into their perspective their fears and their concerns. Because it's, in the 60s or 70s, there was nothing like Will and Grace on TV. There was no really social support that you could recognize visibly unless you were, connected into your own little community, own little protective gay community.
Yeah.
And that's different today. It's much different today. Even though, I guess, recent, how do I say this judiciously? There's a little bit more attacks going on politically about the LGBT community right now. But in essence, the community is, not that it's easy to come out or easy to find your comfort zone, but it's much different today than it was for today's seniors back when they were 20 and 30 and, finding themselves.
I think overall there's been a movement to help try to normalize, diversity and inclusion within other groups within society that, maybe in the past we're seen as different or not equal, and now we're trying to give everybody equal status, equal coverage. Even on a lot of shows now, you see there's so much more diversity. There's typically, it's not just like one group that's represented, they're trying to represent all groups. So there might be somebody from the LGBTQ community, there might be either a Black or a Hispanic person on the show, somebody maybe from a different religious background, like showing that all these different groups can kind of like coexist and be in the same space. Some political figures will make you think that like all of these groups are at odds with each other, when in society that's typically not the case. But I think for LGBTQ seniors in particular, like you're saying, because of the experiences they've had for decades of being on the outs with society and like being seen as something other than an acceptable group within society, like I think there is that fear there's discrimination, or they feel they have to hide their identities within, even within senior living communities. So
very much so.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of those common fears and challenges that they're facing and when they're seeking senior care today, even with like marriage equality and everything else?
Well, a lot of it comes down to your personal comfort zone. And let's just kind of talk turkey here. If we looked at these issues just in a monetary fashion, then, who really would care? But if we look at it in a social capacity, why would I want to go to this physician or attorney or any service provider or community that wasn't inclusive? What does inclusivity mean? I mean, that's, I think, some of the questions that I've always asked myself is, why would I hire a physician that wasn't comfortable working with a gay person?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't. Now, I would respect that person's position in one sense, but I would want to know that up front. And it's the same thing in, I think, any type of service, is that, why would you why would you want to be involved with somebody that doesn't want to be involved with you? But how do you find that information out?
Yeah.
I mean, that is always a struggle for any type of customer. I think that's the generic word for any type of customer. How do you would you work with somebody that isn't comfortable working with you? And I think that's why this whole discussion about people who come out, they come out when they're comfortable coming out. And it's coming out as a personal decision. But it certainly helps in aligning yourself with services that can be beneficial to you and your care. And that's why, again, I always come back to the story sharing, because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. People, when they hear your story, when a service provider hears your story, they understand you a little bit better, and they can provide that service that you're seeking. But you have to feel comfortable in being able to share it. And that's where you learn whether or not is this a fit. And I've had good and bad experiences. Richard and I had good and bad experiences, as you could read in the story. At the worst of times, we had a horrible experience after he died. And some of these things you don't know until you're in the middle of it. But for today's seniors, and this is kind of across the board, but even more so for LGBT seniors, isolation. I'm sure you've heard that word quite a bit in your career. Isolation, but for LGBT seniors, they're more likely not to have a family of origin. Their family is by choice. Their friends, their community. That also plays a role in any professional decisions that they make. So for service providers, they just need to be aware of those nuances and those fears that LGBT seniors will have, but all seniors really have a fear when they go into a new setting or a service provider. Are we going to get the service that we need? Are we going to be accepted, welcomed? How does a community make that happen?
I know you talked about, there needing to be more than just displaying a pride flag or, undergoing like some basic sensitivity training. I mean, what else can providers do to genuinely support LGBTQ residents?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, the sensitivity training is certainly appropriate. And there's a number of organizations out there that do that. I was involved with a social service agency by the name of SunServe in Fort Lauderdale, who provided a training for healthcare. SAGE is another one, but there's multiple opportunities out there for communities to kind of bone up on sensitivity training and the unique needs of today's LGBT seniors. But the other thing I think is important is your community in and of itself. The community is not just the employees. The community is a robust group of people that come from a very diverse set of beliefs. How welcoming are your other residents? It's one thing to have your training. It's one thing to have all your policies in place for employees. And that's all. That's very important. But what about the other residents? Are they welcoming? And how do you combat those that may not be? Because it's a realistic question to ask, because everybody comes from a different perspective.
Sure.
But what I've learned in my experience is three things that are common across the board. Everybody wants to feel it. Everybody wants to give it. And it's going to sound corny. That's showing my age by using the word corny. But it's love, care, and commitment. That's really what, if I can put it into simplest terms, for any community, how are you demonstrating love, care, and commitment to your staff and to the residents of all backgrounds, experiences, faith, orientation? How do you do that? It's more than just, like you mentioned, putting a pride flag on your front door. Mm-hmm. What's your marketing material? Does your marketing material display same-sex couples? I I know with the advent of social media and target marketing, there's ways of adjusting marketing to target specific communities. But what's your generic marketing look like? If I walked into your community and picked up your pamphlet, would it just be heterosexual couples? I don't know. It's a tell. That in and of itself is just kind of like a telling sign.
I think your point too about the residents themselves. I mean, the staff and the messaging can talk all about inclusion all day long, but do they really know their residents and what their residents are comfortable with and not comfortable with? Because that would be obviously the worst case scenario for someone to move into a community where they don't feel like they're on equal ground with their fellow residents. That would definitely not make anyone feel safe. And I think that kind of brings me to the next question. We're kind of talking a little bit about a lot of providers now are transitioning more into like what they're calling lifestyle communities.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah,
they're bringing people together that are that have shared experiences and values, and it's not just an LGBTQ community. It can be a mixed community of all sorts. But I mean, what does it take in that sense to create an inclusive and welcoming lifestyle community for LGBTQ seniors? Is it just drawing in on other LGBT seniors, or is there a broader scope and spectrum of what that community could look like?
Well, when I hear the word lifestyle, I can think about my life for sure, all the things that I've done in my life.
Yeah.
When I put it in the context of a senior living community, if I'm looking at a variety of communities, and they all say and I say this kindly, the buzzword is lifestyle. But how does that lifestyle apply to me as an individual? What is it inclusive of? It's more than just events, games, exercise. It's about the spirit. What spirit are you demonstrating with that lifestyle? Is that an inclusive spirit? And what I guess when you hear the word inclusive, that's kind of vague in one sense. But when I say inclusive, it's kind of like of all walks of life, culture, orientation, goodness, religious background. I spent 6 years in the seminary, so I have like I say, a kind of a cornucopia background of experiences. But if I'm signing up for a lifestyle, I want to know that lifestyle is inclusive of everybody, not exclusive. And how do you demonstrate that?
Would it be off base to say that calling LGBTQ a lifestyle is offensive? Because I feel like it is.
Yeah, it is offensive.
Okay.
It's not a choice.
Yeah, it's exactly like I think lifestyle, I think like the hobbies and things that I enjoy doing as a person, not my sexual preference or how I'm made up in my DNA.
Here's a funny example. And again, I'm talking from my own personal experience, but I know being in the gay community, I understand that this is pretty prevalent. Well, you know what? I'm a really big hockey fan. In fact, I played hockey, and I had somebody come up to me, so aren't you gay? And I said, well, yeah, is that a problem for you? No. But you like hockey? I said, well, yeah. I mean, why not? I said, so again, it comes back to really to educating. Yeah. there's a variety of, everybody has their own likes and dislikes, no matter what your orientation is. Well, then I kind of blew the person away. I said, well, I also bowled professionally. You bowled, you what? You bowled, yeah, there's a lot of gay people that bowl. So again, it comes back to, we have these images of what people are, what they think people are, but when they meet somebody that doesn't fit that motif, then they go, oh yeah, you're just like my neighbor. And again, it comes back to our story. People related to our story because they could put themselves in our shoes. Mm-hmm. They could see the struggles with healthcare. They could see the legal struggles. They could see the love, care, and commitment. It was an afterthought in our story that it just happened to be about two men. And I think when we put that into perspective about care in general, that's when people really start to get it. Because the last thing you want to deal with as you're aging, and especially in the time when life transitions, of any outside drama from somebody trying to impose their own beliefs or wishes on something that they really don't have a clue on.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Absolutely. I mean, that makes me think about LGBTQ seniors and their families when they're searching for a community. What should they be asking? What are the key things that they need to ask providers to assess like inclusivity and support and make sure that they feel like this is a good place for them and their loved one?
I think the most important question to ask is, over and above all the fabulous meals and all the wonderful amenities, can you introduce me to one of your LGBT residents? That's the basic question. Because as I've experienced, we're kind of in the same podcasting area. The best salespeople for a senior living community are the residents, mm-hmm. and especially the LGBT when they're trying. I won't reveal the community's name, but when I was in the midst of working in social service, there was a particular community here in South Florida that I would go and inquire about doing presentations, and well, we don't have any gay seniors here. Like, oh, you don't? Really? You don't think? Really? You don't? No. In fact, we don't even mark. Well, that community now has, I'd say probably close to 150 residents, gay senior residents. And again, this is just my personal opinion on this, because there's been some changes. These seniors, doctors themselves, social workers, professors, all of a sudden you notice that they can afford some of these communities. Well, then maybe we have a different perspective. And that's unfortunate in one sense, but it comes back to my point of, for any LGBT individual that's looking to go into a senior living community, ask the salesperson to introduce you to one of their LGBT residents and go and talk to them.
Yeah.
That's where you're going to get the best information.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopes that there would be others in the community for sure. I mean, I think in any situation, being the token representative of a group is challenging. Mm-hmm. There's actually a book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. I don't know if you've read it. Malcolm Gladwell, he just published it's like the second version of his book from the early 2000s, but he talks about the power of thirds. So essentially, like once a group's tipping point gets beyond like 1/3 of the total demographic of the group, that's where they truly have like power and equality, and they feel like they're inclusive and they're part of something. But when it's just a few amongst many, it becomes very challenging for someone to feel safe or comfortable in that environment.
Exactly. And, it reminds me of this great documentary that was done in 2010 called Gen Silent. Hey. Gen Silent, writer-director Stu Maddox, he took on the issues facing LGBT seniors and aging and and the fears going into a community, whether it's just, if you're looking to be educated on what the issues are about LGBT seniors and senior living and aging, Gen Silent, even though it's 14 years old now, it talks specifically and it has examples of folks who went into senior living, some folks that decided to stay at home. It's very powerful, and it really focuses on the stories of why and how communities can better serve their diverse clients and residents. I highly recommend everybody taking a look at Gen Silent. And again, it's another avenue of resource, stories, and these are real life stories. These aren't fictitious stories that are made up on social media.
Yeah.
These are people that have real life concerns about being discriminated at the most time when they're helpless. The social worker in me gets my juices flowing when I think about people imposing their own beliefs on somebody.
Yeah. In their most vulnerable state like that.
In their most vulnerable state.
Yeah. Talking about your network now, you've created the Whole Care Network, which is an amazing network for caregivers. How can families use these resources to become better advocates for their loved ones in senior living settings?
Well, we've got a variety of podcasters on the Whole Care Network. They all have a story to share or a cause to promote. The Whole Care Network was created as a memory for Richard, and a way for folks that are in this care space to feel like their voice can be heard. And we also have a number of podcasts on the network that are relatable to senior living, that you can listen to residents sing the praises of why they selected this particular community. You can listen to executive directors of why they're in the business. It comes back to hearing people in their own voice and in their own words share their why. And so that's pretty much why the Whole Care Network was created. It was a way for me to give back to the caregiving community. What was once a passion project now has over 1 million downloads and much more than one person can handle themselves. So,
how many podcasts do you have on your network now?
We have 70 podcasts on our network.
It's amazing.
Right now, I'd say 10 of those are active, but mindful. And this is really the great thing about podcasting, is that they're evergreen. So, like my Healing Ties podcast, I haven't podcasted in a couple of years on that brand, but I continue to get 800 to 1,000 downloads of that podcast a month, because the topics are still consistent with the conversation. The topics really never go away when it reverts to care and caregiving and senior living. It's, the issues, the main issues are usually consistent. So that's why I keep all the old podcasts up, because I see people are still listening.
Yeah, I find that's the case too. A lot of, even we've only been running our podcast for a year now, and some of our older episodes are still getting the most downloads. Some of the content just is evergreen, so I think people like to go back and listen to those things.
Yeah.
Lastly, I think outside of just how people can connect with you, ask one last question about caregiving in general, and senior care. So you've talked about the importance of communication and honesty, especially when it comes to the LGBTQ community and senior care. So how can senior living communities ensure that their commitment to inclusivity is reflected in their everyday interactions with residents and their families, and maybe even in their communication with those residents and families?
Well, I think it comes back to simply to messaging.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are, this might be a little controversial, but, there's in South Florida where I live, it's a very comfortable conversation to have. But in other parts of the country, it's not. But there are gay people in those parts of the country that are looking for a safe and welcoming community. And I think it really comes down to your messaging, making those folks feel, making's not the right word, ensuring that those folks feel comfortable in your community. What that messaging is going to be different for each area.
Sure.
But I would also challenge communities that if you and your staff aren't comfortable taking on an LGBT client, then don't do it. Don't put yourself and them through it just for the sake of having a census. It's not worth it in the long run.
That's good advice. I think lastly, I know you've got a lot of projects going on, a lot of speaking engagements. Can you share any upcoming projects or events that our audience should keep an eye out for?
Well, right. One of the main projects that's in the works right now is a film project called My Green Folder. My Green Folder is based on our experience as an LGBT caregiver. You can go to mygreenfolderfilm.com and learn about the project. And the great thing about this project, we've got a script written. We're looking for producers, but it's my final act of caregiving for Richard. Richard always wanted to work on Broadway, not as an actor, even though he would have been hilarious, but he always wanted to work in theater, and his father wouldn't let him. This is my last act of caregiving for Richard. So the My Green Folder Film Project, it's about our story, but it's also reflective of today's times. I've learned this, it's a dramedy, a drama and comedy. So that's one of the works in place right now, and my brand that I'm working towards from there is called Aging Gayfully: How to Live Your Second Chapter of Your Life in Fulfillment. And it's funny, I mentioned aging gayfully to somebody, and they looked at me and said, "Well, I'm not gay," and I said, "Well, I didn't ask you if you were gay. I'm asking you, how are you aging gayfully?" And they stopped for a second, and they got the double entendre. I said, "I may identify as a gay person, but how are you aging gayfully? How are you creating a life in your second chapter that is fulfilling?"
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the next. I'll always have a project to do, but those are the two on the horizon, as well as the Whole Care Network.
That's great. So what's the best way for our audience to stay connected with you and learn more about the resources you offer through the Whole Care Network?
Best way is you can email me at chris@wholecarenetwork.com. You can go to the Whole Care Network, and goodness, there's tons of resources, mostly all audio and video. But you can pretty much get me at the wholecarenetwork.com or Aging Gayfully or My Green Folder Film. While I'm not as active on social media as I once was, I'm pretty easy to find. Christopher MacLellan Caregiving would probably get you to all my contacts as well.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure we include all those links in the show notes, and so people can connect with you on all those projects. I'm excited about the film. I think that's going to be great. That sounds exciting. So
yeah, I'm committed to getting that to production.
Yeah. As we wrap up today's episode, I just want to extend a heartfelt thank you to you, Chris. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you for being so open and vulnerable and willing to share your story with our audience. I really appreciate that.
It's been a pleasure. I'm always willing to talk about Richard and the story and share our experiences, because I know there are people, everybody's going to have their turn at caregiving. And I want to be able to share experiences on how you can make it easier, just a tad bit easier for yourself.
Yeah. And I think it's really important for our audience to learn a little bit more about LGBTQ aging and how care is handled and how we can make everyone feel welcome at a community. So I think we made some steps today to help educate our audience a little bit more in that space too. So thank you for that. If you want to stay connected with Chris MacLellan and learn more about his work, be sure to visit his website, thewholecarenetwork.com, and follow him on social media. And again, we'll put all of these in our show notes, so you have links to all of his stuff. You can keep tabs on what he's got going on. And definitely check out his show too. He's got some amazing podcast episodes on his network. So I highly recommend. I'll leave the link for that as well. As always, we hope you found this episode insightful and inspiring. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore the dynamic world of senior living and senior care. Also, remember that From Leads to Leases isn't just an audio experience. We're also a video podcast. So if you want to see the video versions of our episodes, like the one here with Chris, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube or Spotify channel. So I'm Jerry Vinci, CEO of CCR Growth. Thank you for joining us on From Leads to Leases, where we're giving you all of these great senior living industry insights for free and asking nothing in return other than for you to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who might find it useful. I'm truly grateful for your time and attention. Until next time, lead with strategy and with heart. Chat with you again. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks for listening to From Leads to Leases. Are you ready to fill your rooms faster and increase occupancy? Visit ccrgrowth.com to learn about our Senior Growth Innovation Suite, a proven system to generate highly qualified, tour-ready leads, accelerate sales, and reduce acquisition costs. Let's connect and turn your challenges into opportunities. See you next time.